Every morning at 4:30, while the rest of the town was still asleep, Margaret Ellen Hayes would wake up in the darkness of her small bedroom. She never needed an alarm clock. Her body had learned this rhythm over 20 years of doing the same thing, day after day, without fail. She would sit on the edge of her bed for a moment, listening to the silence of the house. It was a deep kind of quiet, the kind that settles into a place when someone has lived alone for too long. Then she would get up, wash her face with cold water, tie her graying hair into a simple bun, and put on her work clothes, not by 5:15. She was already walking down the empty streets of Millbrook, a small town where everyone knew everyone, and nothing exciting ever happened. The street lights would still be glowing, and the only sound was her footsteps on the pavement. She liked this time of day. It felt like the world belonged only to her. Margaret worked at a diner called the Morning Cup. It sat on the corner of Main Street, and had been there longer than most people could remember. The paint was peeling on the outside, and the chairs inside had seen better days. But the coffee was good, and the prices were fair. That was enough to keep the regulars coming back. She had worked there for over 15 years. She was the one who opened the doors every morning, turned on the lights, and started the first pot of coffee before anyone else arrived. By 6 o'clock, the early risers would begin to trickle in. Farmers, truck drivers, old men who had nowhere else to be. They all knew Margaret, but none of them really saw her. To them, she was just the quiet woman who filled their cups and wiped down their tables. She moved through the diner like a shadow, always there, but never noticed. She rarely spoke unless someone spoke to her first, and even then, her answers were short and polite. A smile here, a nod there. Nothing more. The younger waitresses would chat and laugh with the customers, making jokes and collecting generous tips. But Margaret kept to herself. She did her job well, never complained, and went home at the end of her shift without making a fuss. Some of the regulars had been coming to that diner for years, and still did not know her last name. In a town like Millbrook, people talked. They talked about the weather, about their neighbors, about who was getting married and who was getting divorced. And sometimes, when there was nothing else to talk about, they talked about Margaret. They called her the lonely woman on Cedar Lane. They said she had wasted her life taking care of her sick mother and never got the chance to live for herself. They said it was a shame, really, that such a thing could happen to a person. But they said it the way people talk about the weather, with interest, but without any real feeling behind it. The truth was, most of them had already made up their minds about who Margaret was. She was simple. She was plain. She was the kind of woman who would live and die in the same small town without ever doing anything worth remembering. And Margaret had heard these whispers enough times that she had started to believe them herself. But there was one thing the people of Millbrook did not know. Every night, after the sun went down and the streets grew quiet, Margaret would come home to an empty house that did not feel so empty anymore. She would make herself a small dinner, sit by the window, and watch the stars come out. And then she would walk over to the corner of her living room, where an old piano stood against the wall. It had belonged to her mother. The wood was faded and scratched, and some of the keys stuck when you pressed them. But to Margaret, it was the most beautiful thing she owned. She would sit down on the bench, close her eyes, and begin to play. And then she would sing. Her voice was not like anything you would expect from a woman like her. It was rich and deep, full of feeling and power. When she sang, it was like something inside her came alive. All the sadness, all the loneliness, all the years of being invisible would pour out of her and fill the room with sound. She sang old songs, the kind her mother used to hum when Margaret was a child. She sang church hymns and folk songs, and sometimes, when the mood was right, she would make up her own melodies and let them drift through the empty house like ghosts. No one ever heard her. She made sure of that. She kept the windows closed and the curtains drawn. Singing was her secret, her one private joy in a life that had very little joy left in it. It had not always been this way. When Margaret was young, she had dreams. She used to imagine herself standing on a big stage, somewhere far away from Millbrook, with bright lights shining down on her and hundreds of people watching. She would sing, and they would listen, and for once in her life, she would be seen. But her mother had put an end to those dreams a long time ago. Her mother was a hard woman. Not cruel exactly, but strict and practical, in a way that left no room for foolishness. She believed that people like them were not meant for big things. They were meant to work hard, keep their heads down, and be grateful for what they had. Dreaming was dangerous, because dreams could break your heart. When Margaret was 17, she had worked up the courage to tell her mother that she wanted to audition for a singing competition in the next town over. She had practiced for weeks, saved up money for a new dress, and believed with all her heart that this was her chance. Her mother had looked at her for a long moment, then shook her head slowly. She told Margaret that she was not the kind of girl who belonged on stages. She said that people would laugh at her, that she would only embarrass herself. She said it was better to stay home and be safe than to go out into the world and be hurt. Margaret never went to that audition. She told herself that her mother was only trying to protect her. And maybe that was true. But something inside her broke that day, something she never quite managed to put back together. Years passed. Margaret stayed in Millbrook. She got a job, paid her bills, and watched as the people around her got married, had children, and built lives of their own. She dated a few times, but nothing ever stuck. The men she met seemed to look right through her, the same way everyone else did, and then her mother got sick. It started slowly, the way these things often do. A little forgetfulness here, a little weakness there. But before long, it became clear that her mother could no longer take care of herself. So Margaret moved back into the old house on Cedar Lane and became her mother's caretaker for 18 years. She cooked her mother's meals, gave her medicine, helped her to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and held her hand during the bad days. She gave up everything. Her job became part-time. Her social life disappeared completely. Her world shrank down to the size of that small house and the woman who lived inside it. When her mother finally passed away, Margaret was 45 years old. She stood at the funeral and looked around at the handful of people who had come to pay their respects. And she realized, with a heavy heart, that she had no idea what to do with the rest of her life. 2 years had passed since then. Margaret was now 47. She still worked at the diner. She still lived alone in the house on Cedar Lane. And she still sang to the empty walls every night, her voice as beautiful as ever, heard by no one. She had accepted her fate. This was her life, and it was too late to change it now, or so she thought. It was the middle of June when everything started to shift. The summer heat had settled over Millbrook like a heavy blanket, and the days stretched long and slow. Margaret had just finished her morning shift at the diner and was walking home when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from a number she had not heard from in almost 3 years. It was her younger cousin. Diane. Diane was the daughter of Margaret's aunt on her father's side. They had grown up together as children, spending summers catching fireflies and making up stories in the backyard. But life had taken them in different directions. Diane had moved to the city, got a job in marketing, traveled the world, and lived the kind of life Margaret could only dream about. They had drifted apart the way family sometimes does, not because of any argument, but simply because time has a way of pulling people in different directions. The message was short and unexpected. Diane was going through a difficult time. She had just ended a long relationship and needed to get away from the city for a while. She asked if she could come stay with Margaret for a few weeks, just to clear her head. Margaret read the message twice. She was not used to having guests. The house on Cedar Lane had been quiet for so long that she could not imagine another voice filling its rooms. But Diane was family, and Margaret had never been the kind of person to turn anyone away. She typed back a simple reply, "Of course, come whenever you need." 3 days later, Diane arrived. She pulled up in a bright red car that looked out of place on the dusty streets of Millbrook. When she stepped out, Margaret barely recognized her. Diane had always been beautiful, but now she looked tired. Her eyes, which used to sparkle with mischief, seemed dull and sad. She hugged Margaret tightly and did not let go for a long time. That first week was quiet. Diane slept a lot, sometimes until noon. She would sit on the porch in the evenings and stare at the sky without saying much. Margaret did not push her to talk. She understood that some wounds needed silence before they could begin to heal. Instead, Margaret went about her usual routine. She worked her shifts at the diner, came home, cooked simple meals, and tried to make Diane feel comfortable. They would eat dinner together and watch old movies on the television. It was nice, in a way, having someone else in the house. The silence did not feel so heavy anymore. But Diane was not the kind of person who could stay quiet for long. By the second week, she started to come back to life. She began asking questions about the town, about Margaret's job, about what she did for fun. Margaret did not have many answers. Her life was not exciting. She worked, she came home, she slept. That was it. Diane frowned when she heard this. She could not understand how someone could live such a small life in such a small town. She started dragging Margaret out of the house, insisting they go for walks, visit the local shops, sit by the lake, and watch the sunset. Margaret protested at first, but secretly she enjoyed it. She had forgotten what it felt like to have a friend. One evening, something happened that would change everything. Diane had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache. Margaret stayed up a little longer, cleaning the kitchen and putting things away. When she was done, she walked over to the piano in the corner of the living room. She had not played in a few days, and her fingers were itching to touch the keys. She sat down, glanced toward the hallway to make sure Diane's door was closed, and began to play. The melody came easily, an old hymn she had known since childhood. And then, without thinking, she began to sing. She lost herself in the music the way she always did. Her voice filled the room, rising and falling with the notes. She sang with her whole heart, letting all the emotions she kept locked inside pour out through the sound. For those few minutes, she was not the invisible woman from the diner. She was someone else entirely, someone free. When the song ended, she sat in the silence for a moment, her hands still resting on the keys. And then she heard a sound behind her. She turned around and saw Diane standing in the hallway. Her face was pale, and there were tears streaming down her cheeks. Margaret's heart dropped. She felt exposed, like someone had walked in on her in the middle of something private. She started to apologize, started to explain, but Diane held up her hand to stop her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Diane walked slowly across the room and sat down next to Margaret on the piano bench. She took Margaret's hands in her own and looked her straight in the eyes. She asked Margaret how long she had been able to sing like that. Margaret shrugged and said she had always sung ever since she was a little girl, but she never sang for anyone. It was just something she did for herself. Diane shook her head slowly. She told Margaret that what she had just heard was not ordinary. It was not just good. It was extraordinary. She said that in all her years of living in the city, going to concerts and shows and performances, she had never heard anything quite like it. Margaret's voice had made her feel things she could not even put into words. Margaret did not know how to respond. She was not used to compliments. She tried to brush it off, saying it was nothing special, just a silly hobby. But Diane would not let it go. She asked Margaret why she had never done anything with her voice, why she had never tried to share it with the world. Margaret was quiet for a long time before she answered. She told Diane about her mother, about how she had once dreamed of singing on a stage, and how her mother had told her that people like them were not meant for that kind of life. She told her about the audition she never went to, the dreams she buried, the years she spent convincing herself that her mother was right. Diane listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, Diane squeezed her hands tighter. She told Margaret that her mother had been wrong. She said it gently, but firmly. She understood that Margaret's mother had probably been scared, probably thought she was protecting her daughter from disappointment. But fear is not the same as truth. And just because someone loves you does not mean they always know what is best for you. Margaret felt something stir inside her chest. It was an old feeling, one she had not felt in a very long time. It was hope. Over the next few days, Diane kept bringing up the same idea. There was an annual talent showcase in Millbrook every summer. It was a big event, one of the few things that brought the whole town together. People came from neighboring counties to watch. There were singers, dancers, musicians, comedians. Anyone could sign up. Diane wanted Margaret to enter. At first, Margaret refused. The idea was ridiculous. She was 47 years old. She had never performed in front of anyone. The thought of standing on a stage with all those people watching made her feel sick to her stomach. She told Diane to drop it, but Diane did not drop it. Every day, she found a new way to bring it up. She would casually mention how close the registration deadline was. She would talk about how much joy it would bring people to hear Margaret sing. She would remind Margaret that she had spent her whole life living for other people, and maybe it was time to do something for herself. Margaret kept saying no, but with each passing day, her no started to sound less certain. One night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She thought about all the years she had spent being invisible. She thought about her mother's voice telling her to stay small, stay safe, stay hidden. And she thought about Diane's words. Fear is not the same as truth. What if her mother had been wrong? What if she had spent her whole life believing a lie? The next morning, Margaret woke up early. Before she could talk herself out of it, she got dressed, walked to the community center, and found the registration table for the talent showcase. Her hands were shaking as she picked up the pen. She wrote her name on the form. Then she walked out before anyone could see the tears in her eyes. For the first time in 30 years, Margaret Ellen Hayes had decided to take a chance on herself. She had no idea what would happen next. But for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. The days after Margaret signed up for the talent showcase passed in a blur of regret and panic. She woke up every morning with a knot in her stomach that would not go away no matter what she did. She tried to distract herself with work, with cleaning, with anything that would keep her mind busy. But no matter how hard she tried, the fear was always there, sitting heavy in her chest like a stone. What had she been thinking? She was not a performer. She was a waitress who sang alone in her living room. There was a difference between singing for yourself and singing for a crowd of strangers. A big difference. And now she had gone and put her name on a list like some foolish girl who still believed in fairy tales. She thought about going back to the community center and taking her name off the registration. She thought about it every single day. But something stopped her. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the look on Diane's face when she had told her the news. Or maybe, deep down, there was a tiny part of her that wanted to see this through, even if it terrified her. Diane, of course, was thrilled. She acted like Margaret had just announced she was running for president. She started making plans immediately. They needed to pick a song. They needed to figure out what Margaret would wear. They needed to practice, practice, practice until every note was perfect. Margaret tried to keep up with her cousin's energy, but it was hard. Every time she opened her mouth to sing, she felt like the walls were closing in on her. Her voice, which had always come so naturally when she was alone, now felt shaky and uncertain. She kept making mistakes, forgetting lyrics, losing her breath at the wrong moments. Diane told her it was just nerves. She said it was normal to feel this way before a big performance. But Margaret was not so sure. Maybe her mother had been right all along. Maybe she was not meant for this. The night before the showcase, Margaret could not sleep. She lay in bed with her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, while her mind raced through every possible disaster. What if she forgot the words? What if her voice cracked? What if she walked out on that stage and everyone laughed at her? She imagined the faces of the townspeople, the same people who had looked through her for years. She imagined them whispering to each other, shaking their heads, wondering what on earth had possessed the quiet woman from the diner to make such a fool of herself. By the time the sun came up, Margaret had convinced herself that she could not do it. She would call the community center and tell them she was sick. She would stay home and pretend none of this had ever happened. It was the only sensible thing to do. But when she came downstairs, Diane was already in the kitchen, making breakfast with a smile on her face. She had laid out a dress on the back of the couch. It was simple but beautiful, a deep blue color that Margaret had admired in a shop window weeks ago. Diane had gone back and bought it without telling her. Margaret looked at the dress, then at her cousin. Diane's eyes were full of hope and excitement. She believed in Margaret. She really, truly believed in her. Margaret did not have the heart to disappoint her. So she said nothing about backing out. She ate her breakfast, took a long shower, and spent the afternoon trying to calm her nerves. Diane helped her with her hair and makeup, fussing over every little detail like it was the most important day of their lives. And maybe, in some ways, it was by evening. They were in the car, driving toward the community center. The streets of Millbrook were busier than usual. People were walking in groups, chatting and laughing, all heading in the same direction. The talent showcase was the biggest event of the summer, and it seemed like the whole town had turned out. Margaret's hands were trembling in her lap. She gripped them together tightly, trying to hold herself steady. Diane glanced over at her and reached out to squeeze her arm. She told Margaret that everything was going to be fine. She told her to just breathe and trust herself. But Margaret could barely hear her over the pounding of her own heart. When they arrived at the community center, the parking lot was nearly full. They had to park at the far end and walk across the gravel in the fading light. Margaret moved slowly, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. Every step brought her closer to the moment she had been dreading for weeks. Inside, the building was buzzing with energy. There were people everywhere, setting up chairs, adjusting microphones, running back and forth with clipboards and coffee cups. A long table near the entrance was covered with programs and name tags. A woman behind the table smiled at Margaret and handed her a number, 14. She was contestant number 14. Margaret pinned the number to her dress and followed Diane into the main hall. The stage at the front of the room looked enormous. Bright lights hung from the ceiling, pointed down at the wooden platform like spotlights, waiting to expose her every flaw. Rows and rows of chairs stretched out before it, and people were already starting to fill them. Margaret felt dizzy. She grabbed Diane's arm to steady herself. Diane led her to a quiet corner backstage where the other contestants were gathered. There were about 20 of them in total. Some were warming up their voices, humming and stretching. Others were practicing dance moves or tuning instruments. They all looked so confident, so comfortable in their own skin. Margaret watched a young woman in a sparkling dress run through a complicated vocal exercise without breaking a sweat. Next to her, a man in his 20s was doing push-ups to pump himself up. A group of teenagers in matching outfits were laughing and taking pictures together. Like this was just another fun night out. Margaret felt completely out of place. She was the oldest person in the room by at least 15 years. Her dress, which had seemed so pretty that morning, now felt plain and outdated. She did not belong here. She was a fool for ever thinking she did. She turned to Diane and whispered that she could not do this. Her voice was shaking. She said she was sorry, but she had to leave. She had to get out of here before it was too late. Diane grabbed both of her hands and held them firmly. She looked Margaret straight in the eyes and spoke in a calm, steady voice. She told Margaret that fear was a liar. It would say anything to keep you from doing the things you were meant to do. She said that Margaret had spent her entire life letting fear make her decisions. Tonight was her chance to make a different choice. Margaret tried to argue, but Diane would not let her. She reminded Margaret of all the nights she had sung alone in that empty house, pouring her heart into songs that no one ever heard. She asked her if she really wanted to spend the rest of her life wondering what might have happened if she had been brave enough to try. The words hit Margaret like a wave. She thought about her mother, about the audition she never went to, about all the years she had wasted being invisible. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who dreamed of bright lights and cheering crowds. That girl was still inside her, buried under decades of fear and doubt. Maybe it was time to let her out. Before she could respond, a voice came over the speakers. "Contestant number 14, please make your way to the stage." Margaret's heart stopped. This was it. There was no more time to think, no more time to run. She had to choose right here, right now. Diane squeezed her hands one last time and whispered 3 words. "You got this." Margaret took a deep breath. She let go of her cousin's hands, and she began to walk toward the stage. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever. She could hear the murmur of the crowd on the other side of the curtain, hundreds of voices blending together into a low hum. Her legs felt weak, and her mouth was dry. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to turn around and run, but she kept walking. When she stepped out onto the stage, the lights hit her like a wall of heat. For a moment, she could not see anything. The audience was just a blur of shapes and shadows. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw them. Rows and rows of faces, all turned toward her, all waiting to see what she would do. Someone in the back of the room whispered something to the person next to them. She could not hear the words, but she could imagine them. Who is that? What is she doing up there? Margaret stood frozen in the center of the stage, clutching the microphone like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The music had not started yet. The silence stretched out, long and uncomfortable. And then, from somewhere deep inside her, she heard her mother's voice. People like us are not meant to shine. But right next to it, she heard another voice. Diane's voice. Fear is a liar. Margaret closed her eyes. She thought of every night she had spent singing to empty walls. She thought of every dream she had buried, every chance she had let slip away. She thought of the woman she could have been, and the woman she still had time to become. The music began to play, and Margaret opened her mouth to sing. The first note came out soft and trembling. Margaret barely recognized her own voice. It sounded small and fragile under the bright lights, like a candle flame flickering in the wind. She kept her eyes closed, too afraid to look at the audience, too afraid to see their faces. But then something strange happened. As the second note followed the first, and the third followed the second, Margaret felt the fear begin to loosen its grip. The song she had chosen was Amazing Grace. It was the same song she had sung to her mother on the night she passed away. holding her hand in the dim light of the bedroom, while the machines beeped softly in the background. It was the song that had carried her through the darkest moment of her life. And now, standing on this stage in front of strangers, she let herself go back to that night. She stopped thinking about the audience. She stopped worrying about what they might think. She just sang the way she had always sung when she was alone. From the heart, from the soul, from a place so deep inside her that she did not even have a name for it. Her voice began to grow stronger. The tremble faded away, replaced by something rich and powerful. The notes filled the room, climbing higher and higher until they seemed to touch the ceiling and spill out into the night sky beyond Dot in the audience. Something shifted. People who had been whispering to each other went silent. A man in the front row, who had been checking his phone, slowly put it down and looked up at the stage. A woman near the middle leaned forward in her seat, her eyes wide. One by one, the restless energy of the crowd disappeared, replaced by a stillness so complete that you could have heard a pin drop. Margaret did not notice any of this. She was lost in the music, lost in the memory of her mother, lost in all the years of pain and loneliness that she had carried inside her for so long. Every word of the song meant something to her. Every note was a piece of her story. She sang about being lost and then found. She sang about being blind and then seeing. She sang about grace, the kind of grace that comes to you when you least expect it, when you have given up hope. When you think there is nothing left. Her voice cracked on one of the high notes, but she did not stop. She let the crack become part of the song, let it show the raw emotion underneath. And somehow, that imperfection made it even more beautiful. It made it real. In the third row, an elderly woman began to cry. She did not make a sound, but the tears rolled down her cheeks one after another, catching the light from the stage. Next to her, a young man who had come to the show expecting to be bored found himself unable to look away. He had never heard anything like this in his life. Backstage, Diane was standing in the wings with her hand pressed over her mouth. She had known Margaret could sing. She had heard her that night through the bathroom door. But this was something else entirely. This was magic, the song built toward its final verse. Margaret's voice rose and fell like waves on the ocean, carrying everyone in the room along with her. People were not just listening anymore. They were feeling. They were remembering their own losses, their own regrets, their own moments of grace. The song had stopped being about Margaret and had become about all of them. When she reached the last line, Margaret finally opened her eyes. She looked out at the audience for the first time since she had started singing. And what she saw took her breath away. People were standing. Not just a few of them. All of them. Row after row of people had risen to their feet, their faces shining with tears, their hands pressed together in applause that had not yet begun but was waiting. Building, ready to explode. Margaret held the final note. She let it hang in the air, pure and clear, like a bell ringing out across a silent valley. And then she let it go. For one heartbeat, there was nothing. Just silence. Just stillness. Just the echo of her voice fading into the rafters. And then the room erupted. The applause was like thunder. It crashed over Margaret in waves, so loud and so powerful that she could feel it vibrating in her chest. People were cheering, clapping, calling out words she could not understand. Some were still crying. Others were laughing with joy. A few had pulled out their phones and were recording, trying to capture what they had just witnessed. Margaret stood frozen on the stage, unable to move. She did not know what to do. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times when she was young, but the reality was nothing like her imagination. It was bigger. It was overwhelming. It was almost too much to bear. Diane came running out from backstage and threw her arms around her. She was laughing and crying at the same time, squeezing Margaret so tightly that she could barely breathe. She kept saying the same thing over and over. "You did it. You did it. You did it." Margaret hugged her back, but she still could not speak. Her whole body was shaking. She felt like she had just run a marathon, like she had just climbed a mountain, like she had just done the impossible. The applause continued for what felt like forever. People would not sit down. They would not stop clapping. Every time it seemed like it might be ending, someone would cheer again, and the whole thing would start back up. Finally, one of the organizers came out and gently guided Margaret off the stage. She walked in a daze, barely aware of where she was going. People reached out to touch her arm as she passed, telling her how beautiful it was, how moved they were, how they had never heard anything like it. An older man with gray hair and kind eyes stopped her near the back of the room. He told her that he had lost his wife 2 years ago, and that her song had made him feel close to her again, just for a moment. He thanked her with tears in his eyes, then walked away before she could respond. Margaret made her way to a quiet corner and sat down on a folding chair. Her legs would not hold her up anymore. She put her head in her hands and tried to catch her breath. It was over. She had done it. After 47 years of hiding, of staying small, of believing she was not meant to shine, she had finally let the world hear her voice, and the world had listened. She did not know yet what would happen next. She did not know that a teenage girl in the 5th row had recorded her entire performance on her phone. She did not know that the girl would upload the video to the internet that very night, adding a simple caption that read, "This woman works at my local diner." Nobody knew she could sing like this. She did not know that by morning, the video would have 2 million views. She did not know that by the end of the week, it would have 20 million. She did not know that news stations would start calling, that producers would start reaching out, that her name would be on the lips of people all over the country. All she knew in that moment was that something inside her had changed. For the first time in her life, Margaret Ellen Hayes had let herself be seen. And instead of laughing at her, instead of looking through her, the world had stood up and cheered. She thought about her mother. She wondered what she would think if she could see her now. Part of her wanted to believe that her mother would be proud, that she would finally understand that she had been wrong all those years ago. But another part of her knew that it did not matter anymore. Her mother's voice had held her back for decades. But tonight, Margaret had found her own voice, and it was louder. Diane came and sat down next to her. She did not say anything. She just took Margaret's hand and held it. Outside, the summer stars were shining bright over Millbrook, and somewhere in the distance, a new chapter was already beginning to unfold. Margaret did not know what the future held, but for the first time in a very long time, she was excited to find out. Margaret woke up the next morning to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She reached for it with sleepy eyes, expecting maybe a message from Diane or a reminder about her shift at the diner. But when she looked at the screen, she saw something that made her sit straight up in bed. There were hundreds of notifications. Messages, missed calls, friend requests from people she had never met. Her phone kept vibrating in her hand like it was alive, like it could not keep up with everything that was trying to come through. She did not understand what was happening. She scrolled through the messages, her heart beating faster with every swipe. People were congratulating her. People were saying her voice had made them cry. People were asking who she was, where she came from, how they could hear more. Diane burst into the room a moment later, already wide awake and holding her own phone like it was a winning lottery ticket. She was talking so fast that Margaret could barely keep up. Something about a video. Something about millions of views. Something about the whole world wanting to know the woman who sang Amazing Grace at a small-town talent show. Margaret felt like she was dreaming. This could not be real. Things like this did not happen to people like her, but it was real. And it was only the beginning. Over the next few days, Margaret's quiet life turned upside down. Reporters started showing up in Millbrook, asking questions and taking pictures. News vans parked outside the diner where she worked, and customers came in just to get a glimpse of her. People recognized her on the street, stopping her to shake her hand or ask for a photo. She did not know how to handle any of it. She had spent her whole life being invisible, and now suddenly everyone wanted to see her. It was overwhelming in a way she could not put into words. The phone calls kept coming. Producers from television shows wanted her to appear as a guest. Music executives wanted to talk about recording deals. A famous talk show host invited her to fly across the country and perform live on national television. Margaret listened to all of it with a strange sense of disbelief. Part of her wanted to hide, to go back to her little house on Cedar Lane and pretend none of this had ever happened. But another part of her, a part that had been silent for far too long, wanted to see where this road might lead. Diane helped her navigate the chaos. She screened the calls, sorted through the offers, and made sure Margaret did not get taken advantage of by people who only saw dollar signs. She became Margaret's protector, her advisor, her biggest cheerleader, all rolled into one. 3 weeks after the talent show, Margaret flew to New York City for the first time in her life. She had never been on an airplane before. She had never seen buildings so tall or streets so crowded. Everything felt loud and fast and impossibly big. But when she walked onto the stage of that famous talk show, something inside her settled. The lights were brighter than anything she had ever seen. The audience was larger than the entire population of Millbrook. But when she opened her mouth to sing, all of that faded away. It was just her and the music, the same way it had always been. She sang a different song this time. A song about new beginnings, about finding hope when you thought all hope was lost. Her voice filled the studio, rich and warm. And by the time she finished, there was not a dry eye in the room. The host wiped tears from her own face and asked Margaret what it felt like to finally be seen after all these years. Margaret thought about the question for a long moment before answering. She said that for most of her life, she had believed she was not worth seeing. She had believed that she was meant to stay in the background, to serve others, to never ask for anything for herself. But she had learned something important. She had learned that the stories we tell ourselves are not always true. Sometimes the things we believe about ourselves are just old fears wearing the mask of facts. The audience applauded. The host reached over and squeezed her hand. And Margaret smiled, a real smile, the kind that comes from somewhere deep inside. The months that followed were a wind. Margaret signed a recording contract with a small but respected music label. She spent weeks in a studio, laying down tracks for her first album. It was hard work, harder than anything she had ever done. But she loved every minute of it. She called the album Late Bloom. On the cover, there was a photograph of her standing in a field of wildflowers, her face turned toward the sun. Inside the liner notes, she wrote a dedication. This is for every woman who was ever told she was meant to serve, not to shine. It is never too late to become who you are always meant to be. The album came out in the spring. It debuted at #1. Margaret could not believe it. She kept checking the charts, sure there had been some kind of mistake. But there was no mistake. People all over the country were listening to her songs, sharing them with friends, crying in their cars on the way to work. Her voice, the same voice she had hidden for decades, was now being heard by millions. She did interviews and magazine covers. She performed at concert halls and music festivals. She met famous people who told her they were fans of her work. It was surreal, like living inside someone else's life. But the thing that meant the most to Margaret was not the fame or the money. It was the letters. They came by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Letters from women who had seen her story and felt something shift inside them. Women who had spent years believing they were too old, too plain, too ordinary to chase their dreams. Women who had been told, just like Margaret, that they were not meant for big things. They wrote to tell her that she had given them hope, that her story had made them brave, that because of her, they had signed up for the class, applied for the job, left the relationship, started the business, done the thing they had been too scared to do. Margaret read every single letter. She kept them in boxes in her living room, stacked high against the wall. On the hard days, when she felt tired or doubtful, or wondered if any of it was real, she would sit down and read a few. They reminded her why she was doing this. They reminded her that her voice was not just for her anymore. It belonged to all of them. She went back to Millbrook whenever she could. She visited the diner where she used to work and hugged the people who had known her when she was nobody. She walked the same streets she had walked for 47 years, but now she saw them differently. They were not the borders of her small life anymore. They were the roots that had made her who she was. She started a music scholarship for young people in town who could not afford lessons. She visited schools and spoke to students about believing in themselves, about not letting fear make their choices. She told them her story, all of it, even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts. One afternoon, she drove out to the cemetery where her mother was buried. She stood in front of the simple headstone and was quiet for a long time. She did not feel anger anymore. She did not feel resentment. She just felt a deep, aching sadness for the woman who had been too afraid to let her daughter shine. She knelt down and touched the stone. She told her mother that she understood now. She understood that fear can make people say things they do not mean, do things that hurt the ones they love. She said that she forgave her, and she hoped, wherever she was, that her mother could finally see that it was okay to shine. It had always been okay. Then she stood up, wiped her eyes, and walked back to her car. The sun was setting over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Margaret looked out at the town that had shaped her, the town that had ignored her, the town that had finally heard her sing. She smiled to herself and started the engine. There was still so much life left to live, and she was ready for every moment of it.